in the app. Okay. Excellent. So the app has a scavenger hunt. It's geolocation based. So you get points for each location that you visit. Lowell Observatory is one of them. You just hit on scavenger hunt, get to the flip through to find the Lowell, and put check in. And you say, what does this get me? The answer is not a whole lot. Sorry. But you do get an attendance badge. You get to participate in our competition. And for each attendance badge you get a very corny science joke. So, free festival, this is kind of what we do. All right. Other question I have, because it's not quite 4 o'clock. How did you guys find out about today's lecture? If you raise your hand, it was from the tabloid and the newspaper. Newspaper? Email? Okay. App? Okay, and what about the website? Okay, excellent. If you guys have any suggestions on how to make that website more user-friendly, find me later. I'd be happy to hear them. Yeah. Someone can. Sarah, you know how to lower this? Thanks. Okay. In the interest of time, it's 4 o'clock. Yes. Yes, but as I was telling my friends up here, my memory's awful. So Elizabeth will know when she remembers. She's looking it up. Okay, please come have a seat. Also, so the bio I'm reading is in the app. The second item on the app is the speakers. Click on the speakers, see a picture of them, read about them, see what they're doing. Okay. We're here with Richard Kozak. Rich is a retired geologist with 20 years at the Office of International Geology and the branch of astrogeology of the U.S. Geological Survey here in Flagstaff. I said I would read it quickly, but those words are hard. He worked with many remote sensing systems, including airborne imaging radar systems, radar telescope data, and imaging systems on various spacecraft, including Landsat, CSAT, Shuttle Imaging Radar, Pioneer Venus, the USSR Venera missions, and Voyager. He has several publications and had given several talks on his work, including at the International Lunar and Planetary Science Conference in Houston and other venues. Rich later worked in historical preservation, including getting the Apollo training site, Cinder Lake, on the Arizona State list of historical sites, and also getting Gene Schumacher's Historic Astrogeology Headquarters building determined eligible for inclusion on the National Register of Historic Places. So, big hand for Richard, please. I'm going to give this to you.
Oh, okay. All right, I'm all wired up. Can you hear me just fine? Not too loud? Okay, all right, well, let's see how this works. Yeah, thank you for coming. I want to thank, big thanks to Lowell Observatory for hosting this event and others, and a big thank you to all the people who work on the Festival of Science. It's a great institution. So, harvesting new knowledge from spacecraft data. Brandon's already kind of told you a little bit about what I do, but there's some pretty pictures. I'll throw in something that I like to brag about. As much as working on those other projects, those space missions, was a lot of fun. This was one of the fun times in my career. This is the NASA, we call them the Research and Technology Studies Group, or short RATS. They were looking for a place to do a spacesuit test in preparation for either future lunar missions or Mars missions. So I recommended this area out by Grand Falls. So they invited us to be in this picture, and I want to say this is my claim to immortality, my one and only claim to immortality, because it's an actually, oops, it's actually official NASA photo. That's me up there. I'll just point out real quick, this fellow Rick Balch, a videographer from down in Sedona, because I'm going to talk about him just a little bit later. Okay, getting to today's topic. This is the Surveyor spacecraft. Looks like a lot of people in here probably remember Surveyor. It was the United States' first soft landers on the moon prior to the Apollo landings. And so a lot of you might have seen these pictures, maybe in Life magazine or something, of a picture taken by the on the surface of the. The thing I want you to notice here is all the little pieces, all the little patchwork look to the image. It's because the surveyor took very small little pictures and they're kind of pasted together literally, as I'll show you. Quick summary on surveyors: 1966, 1968. There were 7, 5 successfully landed. I like to always brag on Flagstaff's Gene Shoemaker. He was the chief experimenter for the project. The surveyor took like 11,000 pictures. You can see in that mosaic where there are so many pictures. This is Surveyor crater on the moon, taken by the Apollo 12 astronaut. The lunar module landed on the rim of Surveyor crater. It was a test to see how close they landing, which was instrumental in future missions. I want you to notice here, and I got to remember, right here, you see a little something down in the crater here. That's the surveyor sitting there on the surface. Okay, I mentioned Gene Shoemaker was the chief TV experimenter on there. A little piece, I'm going to do a little bit of local history. Surveyor television experiment field test number 2 occurred out here in just the Sunset Crater. They did a test out here, one of several tests. This shows you can see a boardwalk. This is on the Bonito lava flow out at Sunset Crater being at the top in the background. They had to create this boardwalk to get equipment out, and even at that, they had to create a rig to lower the equipment down where they needed it because it was such a rough flow. This is a still frame taken from a movie that I was involved in helping save. Just want to point out here that they're installing, these gentlemen are installing, that's Elliot Morris, Ray Batson, some locals. They are installing the Surveyor camera on a tripod mock-up of the lunar, of the Surveyor lander. Here's a wider picture. So you see the mock-up sitting there. You see the equipment down here, and here's this kind of rig to get some of the equipment down to where they needed it to go. All right, these were also taken from some 16mm movies that were taken at the time. What I want to point out with these pictures is, I want to explain a little bit, is you can see there's a pin axis here. This is an oval mirror. So that mirror was sticking up, doing this, and what it would do is it would tilt. It would tilt in steps. There's also right here, it rotates on this arm. So the way it would get these mosaics is by tipping, moving, moving. So that explains the crazy quilt work in the pictures. So there it is out on the Bonito flow out by Sunset Crater. And this is Al Bean at the actual Surveyor 3 spacecraft that you saw in that crater picture before, lunar module at the top of the frame there. Bean actually removed the camera and brought it back to Earth, and I believe a local, another Flagstaff local, Hank Holt, looked at that when it was brought back. Okay, so here's an example of mosaics taken by the Surveyor out at Bonito Flow. On the left is using the narrow angle mode of the camera. On the right is the wide angle mode. So that's why it's easier to see detail, and you can actually, the picture on the right is a lot easier to look at. The trade-off with the wide angle is you don't have the detail. But remember, this is back in the 1960s, and that's the way they did things. And let me explain a little bit about the mosaicing procedures that were done at the time. So, literally pasting photos together to put these mosaics together. And in this case, notice the person is using a stapler. So low-tech mosaicing back in the 60s. One of the things I did during my career was doing digital mosaicing. So this is kind of interesting to look at. Here's an example. Rather busy, kind of hard to see, really if you're trying to analyze this, it's really hard to make sense of it because of the mosaicing. Here's an example a fellow named Gary Reynoldson did a number of years ago using one of the Surveyor mosaics, where he basically did some modern image processing and removed a lot of the noise from the mosaic. Now, the thing is, this picture looks nice. It's aesthetically more pleasing, but can we really get any more information out of this? So let's look at, this is going to be the Surveyor 7 target area. And oh, before I go on, I should a shout out to Ray Jordan here. He worked on the Surveyor project, sitting up here, an old friend of mine. So Surveyor 7 landed on the rim of Tycho crater. Are any 2001 Space Odyssey fans in the audience, or at least have seen it? TMA1, remember that, where the monolith was? Stands for Tycho Magnetic Anomaly 1. So, and by the way, 2001 is showing out at Harkins tonight if you want to see it. Just coincidentally, I didn't arrange for that. Okay, so this is a picture from the Surveyor 7 on the rim of Tycho in the old mosaic format. Here's a reprocessed version of that. Now again, a lot prettier looking, but really, is there much more data in here, or is it just a little more pleasing to the eye? So back again to the old one. And now I'm going to zoom in. We're going to zoom in on this outlined area. Look at that. It's almost like an entirely new image. I'll back up real quick so you can see the difference in that. It looks like a picture taken by the Apollo astronauts on the surface. All right, this rock over here. Let's, that rock right there, I'm going to move front and center, and we're going to zoom in on that. Or take it back, not quite yet. So they're back to the original image, and you can see the amazing difference in the data that's there. It makes it a lot more interpretable. But let's look at this rock that's in the foreground, as pointed out by the arrow. That's the large rock down here at the bottom. Okay. Now, there's a rock in the newly processed image, but the rock I'm showing you in the inset is not this one here in the foreground. It is that rock back there. Yeah. Now, let's look at this rock in the foreground. Look at the difference there. What's interesting here is where in the old photo, basically it was black. Let's say you processed it a little differently in the photo lab and brought out some of that detail in the shadow, but nonetheless, you can see a lot more detail in this newly processed image. And what I want to point out here, in the interest of actually interpreting things and not getting too much into the geology, is look at these shapes here, these polygonal shapes in here. These are probably, I would interpret them as large crystals. Okay, large crystals tend to form at great depth. You also look at this crystalline area. It's in a matrix. It seems kind of darker and seems to be defined by about where I'm showing there. So these are what geologists would call, if my interpretation is right, they're called phenocrysts. So the block that they're in would be called a xenolith. It's a rock that was ripped up on the way of either magma moving up to the surface or perhaps being coated in what they call impactite, in other words, impact melt. So the block, we can now possibly interpret it as being ejected from probably Tycho crater. And we can see that maybe this would be, if we were to go back there, we might want to go to this boulder and sample this because of what we've seen from here. Okay, summarizing the surveyor data. The restoration for this was done from film negatives, but not the original downlinked data. By downlinked, I mean the data that was sent telemetry radio signal back from the moon. And we saw that, we could, well, we will, I'll show you, we can get more information if we had the original downlink data. So let's take a look at an example of that. This project was done about 15 years ago, Lunar Orbiter Image Recovery Project, or I'll call it LOIRP for short. It's not a whole lot shorter. And a rather amazing project this was. Real quick recap, Lunar Orbiter, there were 5 missions, orbited the moon from 64 to 68. It was done, it did preparatory mapping of nearly the entire moon. A lot of it was focused on looking for landing sites for the Apollo missions. All right, with this nice big screen that Lowell has here, I think you can see a lot better than my home screen at the difference between the original and the reprocessed stored data. But it's even hard here to tell. Oh, this, by the way, is the first photograph of the Earth taken from the vicinity of lunar orbit. So it was very special, and they had to really argue hard to get them to reprogram and get this picture. Again, reprocessed on the bottom, original on the top. Now, if you think this is impressive, let's zoom in on this area. Okay, it almost, you have to look at it for a little bit to see that it's even the same image. So, and let's do one more. Let's zoom in yet again. Look at that. Now, my friend Ray Jordan here in the front row said, am I going to bring up Keyhole? Lunar Orbiter was based on military spy satellite technology at the time. And if you're aware, at the time, they would actually have film on board these spy satellites. They'd take actual photographic film, and then they would drop it out of orbit, and an airplane would fly by and scoop it up in midair. It's kind of an interesting story. Okay, so backing up, here we go. Here's that zoomed in area from this reprocessed photograph. Here's a shot looking back at the moon. Top one's the original, lower's restored. The people that did this found they got 4 times the dynamic range out of the restored data. You can also see there's also an increased definition in terms of resolution and detail that you can see. Okay, so I just mentioned this film was processed on board the spacecraft. The spacecraft orbit eventually decayed, crashed into the moon. So we don't have what's technically called the first generation data that was acquired. This is what we get back on Earth after they were radioed back to Earth. This is a mosaic made up of a bunch of little strips. The film on board was 70 millimeter, rather large format. And I'll show you, it's kind of important. Don't get too bedazzled by all the detail. But what I've shown here, or I'm sorry, this is somebody else's graph, up in the upper left corner here, shows film supply. Shows the film of the moon over here. It would be scanned, and it would be sent from the spacecraft down to Earth receiving dish, recorded on a receiver on magnetic tape. So in the original process, like the mosaic we just saw, the next step would be to go to here. Kinescope, for those who may not know, kinescope is where you basically point a camera at a TV screen, a CRT screen. If there's any young folks in the audience, a CRT screen may be ancient history to you. But it involved vacuum tubes and electron beams, and it wasn't super great. So what they did was they pointed a camera at a TV screen, recorded the film, then they printed out these 35 millimeter strips. You saw how that was that mosaic was very striped. Then they would take a picture of that. They would mosaic it together, take a picture of that. That's what we saw on the last screen. And then people would work with this. So you're several steps away, several generations away from the original data. Here, 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 and then here. Now, what if you could go back? Well, in fact, the LOIRP people did. They went back to the telemetry data. You mentioned that. Oh, just the fact that the tapes were almost thrown away in this case makes it all the more interesting. But keeping the data is only half the problem. What if you don't have something to read the tapes? Kind of makes them useless, right? Okay, this mission was in the mid-1960s. And we all know computer technology, it just moves along at a rapid clip. Well, they threw away the data. They threw away, I'm sorry, the equipment that could read it. This is a woman's garage. She couldn't bear to see the equipment thrown out. So she collected these tape drives and some other equipment, kept them in her garage for many years. So there's some guys here, moonviews.com, I think they're still up. You can go there and get some more of the history. They had this idea to go back and look at these tapes and reprocess this stuff. Here's a close-up of the stuff in her garage. Now here's the tapes that I mentioned, nearly got thrown out, but somebody put their hand up and said, hey, maybe we shouldn't do that. They didn't. So I mentioned these guys decided to preserve the data, and they set up shop in this abandoned restaurant. Unsurprisingly, the project got the nickname McMoon. All right, now, some of the other equipment they found in a chicken coop. Now, as Steve Jurvetson of the LOIRP points out, that there's only one person on Earth who still refurbishes these tape heads, and he's retiring this year. Now, this was about 14 years ago, or well, actually, more like 20 years ago when they started the project. The skills to read this data archive are on the cusp of disappearing forever. That's an important point that I'm going to come back to in the talk. The equipment you can see here set up inside this restaurant. This is Dennis Wingo. Deserves a whole lot of credit for initiating this project. Another view of their setup. Okay, let's get to why should we bother? It's old spacecraft data. We've got newer. We've got Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter and maybe more data now. Well, here's one reason. It allows us to go back in time, so to speak, to the mid-1960s and see what the moon's like. what the moon was like back then. But you might say, well, it's a dead body. Why do we, it's not going to change. Well, actually it is. It may be all but dead, but there's actually data to be learned from this. So one of the things it does for us is it helps us refine the impactor flux. You've all seen shooting stars probably. Well, there's bigger objects, and the moon's a pretty big body, and it's getting hit by objects all the time. It also allows us to look at study of impacts. If you can look at the moon back in the 60s and you see a new impact on the new data, we can look at how what kind of the geomorphology, if you will, of the impacts and the impact process. It also tells us a little bit about where it hit on the moon. Is it a deep debris layer, or is it solid rock, or what are we looking at? We can tell a little bit about that. I mentioned the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. This is an image from that on the right. If you want to go to this website, you can actually participate. They have so much data, they're asking people to go and help. Look at some of this Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter data, compare it to the Lunar Orbiter data, and see, in this case, the area that's outlined here shows a new crater that's formed since the 1960s. It's got a really long URL. I wouldn't suggest trying to memorize that. Just Google moon diff. Okay, so lessons to be learned. Now, this was 35 years after the mission. And one of the things is that our image processing technology has gotten better. Our computers have gotten a lot faster. People are writing smarter apps. So reprocessing the data is like getting a whole new mission to the moon for very little cost. Because even a basic mission's, hundreds of millions of dollars. I mentioned it's kind of like giving us a time machine to look back at the moon 60 years ago, and gives us a good idea on impact rates in the Earth's neighborhood. All right, let's change and we'll look at a different data set. Apollo. Each mission set up a seismometer on the moon. This is Apollo 11 seismometer. So there were 6 seismometer stations set up. They left them operating until September 77. I think, unfortunately, they stopped because of budget cuts. The equipment, I think, was still operating. I want to show this one, Apollo 17 in the Valley of Taurus Littoral on the moon. This is the seismic station here in the lower right. This was set up by Flagstaff astrogeologist Jack Schmidt. Okay? First and only geologist to do geology on another body in the solar system. Okay, so here's some data. Truthfully, I don't know how to interpret seismic data. I've got a couple hours of it in my education, but the top 4 seismograms are from the moon. On the bottom is a typical Earth seismogram. They look a whole lot different. They were unable to interpret this. They were so different, they didn't know how to interpret this data. Now, as I mentioned, this isn't my field, so I'm going to let NASA's chief scientist, Jim Green, explain it. So they were able to see evidence that the core is divided into a fluid outer part and a solid inner part, and see a distinctive layer above the outer core. Well, that means a lot in terms of people that study the evolution of planetary bodies. All right, let's quick look at a couple of examples from the Apollo rocks brought back. This again is Jack Schmidt with his rock hammer there, sample bag here, rock hammer there. Just want to point this out. If you've looked at Apollo photographs, you'll see this in a lot of pictures. Called a gnomon, and it was developed here in Flagstaff again. Another link to Flagstaff history. Okay, I'll let you read that while I'll tell you. Basically what they did when they got the rocks back from the moon, they were wise enough to set aside about 25% of the samples, just thinking that in the future, they didn't know when we were going to go back to the moon again. So they set aside a number of samples. I think there's about 800 pounds brought back, so that indicates they saved about 200 pounds, anticipating that this technology would advance to where they could do science with these pristine samples in the future. Here's one of the things that's come up, fun thing to go to online. It's called NASA Astromaterials. I'm going to stop doing that. 3D Explorer. So if you want to go online and play with this, what they did was, one of the technologies that has come about since the 1969, 1972 time period is computer tomography. So here's a rock sample on the left. You can go into this app and go in and press these slider buttons and move the cut so you can look at this in 3D. Now you say, okay, that's kind of gimmicky. What good does it do us? Well, it allows us to do what engineers would call non-destructive testing in a sense. We can look inside, like if they did a CT of your body, you can look at the organs, and they have special ways of looking at that. So if there's a little inclusion, something like that, you could look at it in 3D, and that could tell you something. The other useful thing this allows you to do is to, when you can see it, if you're going to slice up this rock and hand out samples, you may want to make your cut in a different position. All right, this is an example of geochemistry example of things that have been learned since the Apollo missions. In this case, it was investigators from ASU and the University of Chicago. And based on samples and some of the analysis they've done, again, with more recent techniques, is they've determined that they believe they can say from this sample using their geochemistry that the moon forming impact occurred about 150 million years after the Earth itself had pretty much coalesced. And they think, I don't know how they can do this, but they also think from the data that they can say that the moon cooled relatively quickly after that impact. It took about 20 million years to cool. So again, these are important things to geoscientists, of passing interest to some people, but nonetheless, it shows some examples of the changes. So what's the lesson of all this? Again, if you don't preserve the data, if you don't, keep some of the rocks aside, you can't go back. Okay, now brings us to what I consider one of the most famous cases of lost data. Okay, how many of you recall this fiasco? All right. Again, I think most of you know, I think this is a, what they might call a meme today, this Michael Jackson doing his moonwalk or whatever. So just okay, so lost Apollo tapes. All right, some headlines from the 2000 aughts. I'm sure a lot of you remember this. It was a big to-do over a couple of periods, both in about 2006 and then again with the Apollo 11 50th anniversary came up again as an issue. All right, now it's not like you figure somebody would have had to tell NASA to keep the home movies, right? I'll let you read this one. Michael Collins, of course, being, if you don't know, he was the command module pilot who flew Buzz and Neil to the moon and back, okay? And was up in orbit by himself. How many of you have seen From the Earth to the Moon series? Oh, you need to see it. It's great. It was an HBO production. It was based on Andy Chaikin's book, A Man on the Moon. And just, let's see what we got here. So Andy was out here in Flagstaff, and I'll explain how I got a hold of some of the Apollo moonwalk tapes in just a little bit. But Andy told me that Buzz Aldrin did not have video of his own moonwalk. He asked me to send him a copy, and I sure did. So I made him a special case and sent him this. And in return, he signed a picture for me. At any rate, so getting back to the topic of the talk, why is the downlink data so important? Well, as we saw with the earlier example, it is important. It makes a huge amount of difference. We have a clock in here. I want to kind of watch the time. Okay. All right, so I'll walk you through the Apollo TV. So the TV data was beamed back from the moon. Okay, this picture here came from Goldstone, which, as many of you know, is out in the Mojave Desert, a few hundred miles west of here. This image, a lot better, came from Honeysuckle Creek, which is in Australia. Now, quick story, if you've seen, I don't know if it's in the movie The Dish, but what happened was they found that Goldstone was having problems, so NASA quickly switched to Honeysuckle. Then for reasons, I think, that Honeysuckle still wasn't quite as good, and they found out that Parks, which is also in Australia, the Parks radio dish, had a better signal. So they again switched to that. This was in the very first couple of minutes of the broadcast. This is a picture of the Parks dish. That's me down there. All right, now this is something that I think a lot of people are not aware of. They did not plan for having a TV transmission from Apollo. Believe it or not, they did not plan for TV. There was a bit of a fight about that. They finally went ahead and got a TV on board, but here's the problem. Because they hadn't planned for it, there was only a certain bandwidth that they could transmit back from the lunar module back directly to Earth. So they had to create a new television system that could use that little available bandwidth. In other words, how much data can go through that stream. So what they did in order to do that, they developed what was called slow scan. Okay, this is a picture taken off a screen at one of the receiving stations in Australia, I believe. Oh, it says honeysuckle. You can see how good that picture is. Let me explain what slow scan is. Oh, and by the way, this is an excellent documentary if you can find it, if you have any interest, Live from the Moon. It's a fantastic documentary on that issue. Okay, so slow scan. What's slow scan? What they had to do was typical, even an old 8mm handheld movie camera was like about 18 frames per second. Today's video, I think, is about 30 frames per second. They had to basically slow down the transmission to 10 frames per second. Very slow. Now, that would not broadcast out to the world at 10 frames per second. So they had to run it through this slow scan processor and create what's called at the time NTSC, television standard signal for broadcast. Okay, so here's an example. Let me jump to the next one because it's actually better. This is a blow-up of those previous pictures. On the left, again, some of the people at the ground stations just went up there, sometimes with an 8mm film camera, sometimes a Polaroid, as in the case on the left here, and just took a picture off screen as they were getting it. So this was the slow scan version. On the right's the NTSC conversion. I think you can see, especially again on this big screen, the difference. I'll point out a few. You can actually see the lunar module leg here, and this is Buzz Aldrin's faceplate. You can see Neil Armstrong's reflected, his head, his life support system on his back, his torso, his legs. On this side, after the NTSC conversion, it's a blob. You couldn't really do any interpretation from that. So also keep in mind with this student taking a Polaroid off of a CRT screen, that's still 2 generations away from the original down data that was sent down. I put this in because it tells us something else that we can do as far as image processing. This confirms the fact that even though the signals might not have all been, one signal was best, but 3 stations were downlinking the data and should have had tapes. So when NASA lost those tapes, they didn't lose 1 set of tapes, they lost all 3 sets of tapes. And had we had those 3 sets of tapes, you could have combined them, and in doing so, you could have enhanced the signal to noise ratio. In other words, gotten a lot better picture. One thing I didn't mention in the last photo is a lot less noise in the background, a lot less streaking and noise. Okay, see if I have time to do this. Anybody remember this story? Let me tell you, this guy sold these tapes. These 3 tapes are 1.8 million. He paid 60 cents in a NASA surplus sale for these 3 tapes. Best purchase ever. Not quite, not quite. I'll explain. Oh, I'll tell you, since you bring it up, not quite. These were still not, but the lost tapes are the downlink data that came right down and were recorded at the big deep space network dishes on the ground. These tapes were ones that were taken right after the NTSC conversion scan. And he still sold them for $1.8 million. But get this, the fact that NASA not only lost, I don't want to bash NASA too much here, but you know, it's common knowledge they lost and apparently sold those other tapes, the downlink tapes, and they were written over. But then they made another mistake and sold off these next generation tapes. Okay, I must have a note here. That was it. Okay, so this fellow, well, this is just a nod to the fathers out there. It was his dad who noticed those 3 tapes out of the 1,100 tapes that he bought, that these had Apollo 11 EVA on them, and his dad said, maybe you ought to keep those. So I don't know if this fellow gave his dad any part of the haul on that. There they are. They're 2-inch Ampex tapes. Just a couple other pieces of little details that I think are just kind of interesting is he hauled them around for 43 years. He had held on to these tapes for 43 years. And he only found out when he went on vacation with a NASA friend who said, we're looking for these lost NASA tapes. So they easily could have gotten lost, you know, if not for these coincidences. All right, that means I have a note here. Okay, I've already mentioned that. Let's move on. Okay, let's skip over that. Okay, another thing about Flagstaff history and Apollo, and I'll get back to my original topic eventually, if you'll pardon me. This is what was called the geology back room down in Houston. It was literally next to mission control, the mission operations control room, you know, where Gene Kranz and Steve Bales and all those famous guys were running the mission. So next door you had a group of geologists. The guy, let's see here, get the pointer. This fellow here, Gordon Swan, Flagstaff. I don't know if anybody here knew him. This is Jim Lovell of Apollo 13, sadly just passed away. Now, I bring this up because I need to say that, tell you, if you don't already know, Gene Shoemaker was the principal investigator of Apollos 11, 12, and 13. This fellow here, Gordon Swan, was principal investigator for Apollos 14 and 15. Gordon was hired by Gene Shoemaker. Okay. The guy who was the PI on Apollos 16 and 17 was this fellow, Bill Mulberger. Bill was hired, not only hired by Gene, but he was a classmate of Gene's at Caltech. So basically, Gene Shoemaker and Flagstaff basically had control of the entire Apollo geology. And that's a whole nother story. I could give several talks on that. Okay, this is something most everybody's seen, if not at the time since then, called the Trench Mission Operations Control Room. And the scene you typically saw was looking over at this screen. See the moonwalk. Rarely you'll see this screen over here, which is a lot different. See a hand here on what looks like maybe a map. I'll show you what that is. So over in the geology back room, they had a camera overhead pointing down this fellow's hand. I used to work for this guy for a while. And he's got basically a map of the lunar module here. This was for Apollo 11, so they weren't going very far. And they were basically mapping out where they were placing instruments and where they were picking up rocks. There's another view of the back room from a BBC special. Okay, why have I got this here? Let's see. So Gordon Swan over here, Jim Lovell on the right. So now I get to the part about a piece of local, it's kind of a secret. Most people don't know about Flagstaff. Gordon Swan over there on the left being the PI on Apollo 15. He was charged with doing a geological survey report summarizing what they learned from Apollo 15. Well, he didn't get it completed. Another fellow here in Flagstaff, Paul Spudis, was given the task. Paul came to me and said, Rich, can you go and get me a set of the Apollo 15 tapes so I can kind of watch along while I'm doing the geology report kind of thing? Well, that's when we discovered. I called NASA. NASA said, we don't have the video anymore, but we can send you some 16 millimeter film. Well, it turns out we had in our data facility up there a bunch of half-inch reel-to-reel videotapes. So, okay, so we tried to find the equipment. Well, guess what? They surplused. They had 3 of these machines. They surplused them all. Luckily, we were able to find the warehouse did keep records. We were able to find out, track down 2 of them, one of which fortunately worked. And this is from a NASA film of the recorder actually being used in the back room by the geologist. So this is another case of what Dennis Wingo of the LOIRP calls technoarchaeology. We've got some data, but we hadn't thought it through, and we got rid of the equipment. So as I say, we were able to track down a couple of these. And here's a rather poor quality picture, but on the right is after we had recovered the machine. It had some electronics problems, only showed us half a picture. We were able to fix that. Even Sony wouldn't touch this thing. They manufactured it, but because it was so old, they wouldn't touch it here in the late 80s. The other thing I want to tell you about this is that because they did not want to use the old original tapes that we had or the machine, they said, can we I forgot who came up with the idea, but the idea was to transfer it to what was then the industry standard, which was called UMATIC. It was a 3/4 inch format. And the reason we wanted to transfer it is we don't want to use your original equipment. It's old enough as it is, and you don't want to damage tapes. But the problem was the electronics were starting to fail. The longer it ran, the worse the picture got. In order to deal with that, I spent about 80 hours in a walk-in cooler transferring the films. So some of the things that you don't hear about, I won't bore you with that one. But in short, while NASA was catching flack in like 2006 and 2019, the truth is, I found out, The National Space Science Data Center's 1977 catalog of lunar mission data mentions only kinescopes. So it suggests to me that the videos were already gone by then. And I don't know if you caught earlier, this fellow who sold the tapes that he had bought for $1.8 million, he bought those in 1976. So it kind of fits the pattern. Just a little bit of history about that story. Okay, so now let me get finally back to the topic of tonight's talk. What if we had the original downlink data tapes from the Apollo TV? So you recognize this from the lunar orbiter schematic earlier. Only in this case, let's replace the onboard film in orbit with the Apollo slow scan camera on the moon. It transmits from the LEM down to the ground station. Receiver picks it up, records that data. I explained the slow scan conversion. So you follow this path, slow scan conversion. You take a picture of it, film, 16 millimeter film off of a TV screen, and that's what we got to see. What if we could go from here straight over and look at that directly? Now, if we did come over directly from the telemetry data over to create a new video from that original first generation data, we'd still have that 10 frames per second slow scan problem. But there's a process called tweening, creating frames in between missing frames. So you could do that easily, create one missing frame, and that'd get you up to 20 frames per second, which is, like I said, equivalent to the old 8 millimeter films. You could probably go to 30 with today's artificial intelligence processing, but we'll never know. Okay, so we can only imagine what the improved images could have looked like. I forgot to mention that Westinghouse did an excellent job building that Apollo TV camera, and it really gave a much better picture than we saw. Okay, so remember the LOIRP people, the quote saying, well, we're lucky there were still people alive that we could go to and help us restore the equipment and get the data back. So let me talk a little bit about other ways of getting, old data and getting more out of old data. So one of the things is that, yes, when people die, you lose an awful lot of information. I started an oral history project back in the late 90s. This is Elliot Morris. I mentioned him early on in relation to the Surveyor project. Early on, the first mapping of the moon, preparing for the Apollo project, was mapping the moon sitting in a telescope. Here, Elliot is describing the telescope that he helped get built in Flagstaff. It's out on Anderson Mesa right now. That's me right there. All right, so I've already mentioned about Elliot. We interviewed Hal Stevens. Hal was a geologist. He used to live in our neighborhood. He went from an interesting path. I won't take too much time to tell it, but basically he spent a lot of time recording this history of the Apollo training and the development of the Apollo procedures here in Flagstaff. So we interviewed him. A couple of shots of Gene Shoemaker that we interviewed. We got about 5.5 hours of interviews with him. We were going to interview him after he got back from his annual trip to Australia. Sadly, he died. Car crash then. This is Gordon Swan. We interviewed him, PI on Apollos 14 and 15. And including others, we interviewed Jack Schmidt. Okay, so just to say that new knowledge can sometimes come just from saving personal knowledge for later use. And using the harvesting data as an analogy, kind of think of this as seed banking. We're putting these things away for later discovery. Okay, I'm getting close to the end here. Another thing, say, is old AV materials, audiovisual materials. I pulled these out of a dumpster. These were being thrown away. 2-inch, what I thought were the standard, what in the day was 2-inch Ampex format tapes. And again, we're going back to this, what Dennis Wingo called the techno-archaeology problems. See by the label on the tape down here, it says field test Hopi Buttes, moonshot phase 3, October, November 66. Based on that date, what I think was on there was something like this. These were taken from some 16 millimeter films that were also saved, since lost, I understand. Field test in the Hopi Buttes, you see a mock-up of the lunar module. They go out there in shirt sleeve usually and rehearse what they were going to do in terms of the procedures for Apollo. So I mentioned those are what I think are videotapes. You can see a video camera on top of this LEM mock-up. It looks like it might have been out to Benito lava flow. Another close-up of the camera. Let's point this out. So there's a camera on top of this. This is stereo periscope. Original idea was to have one man go out and walk on the lunar surface, another man stay in the LEM, maybe even have a microscope, be mapping out where he was going. He could follow him with his stereo microscope, and he could control the video camera with a little box there. Didn't happen that way, but as it turns out, they did incorporate the remote controlled camera idea on the later missions, the J missions, Apollo 15 and thereafter. This is the TV camera mounted on the lunar rover as they're traveling between the two stations. Well, just as I was about to send these tapes off to get them transferred over to something digitized, I found out that they were not the standard AMPACs, that they were this odd helical scan format. Well, guess what? Nobody anywhere has one of these machines. Checking around with, I don't know, about a dozen people around the country, some of the top people in their field, I found out it was recorded on this type of machine, a Sony PV100 model. Turns out they were used on airplanes back in the day to show in-flight movies. Yeah. And once I knew what they were recorded on, I went back to these old films that we'd saved and restored, and you can see it actually in operation, that we can verify it was that indeed that model machine that it was recorded on. So now that I knew what kind of machine I was looking for, I was trying to find somebody that had one. And I've checked the Smithsonian, I've checked all the top people in the country. Nobody has one of these machines. I've tracked one down in Belgium, and hoping they'll work with us. I haven't followed up on that. Okay, real quickly, again, what time? 3 minutes, I think I can do. Okay, so there's 16mm films I mentioned. I found some, these are some film cans. At the top, you see what kind of terrible condition is. I mentioned early on, a fellow Rick Walsh, a videographer down in Sedona. That's him here. And he was instrumental in helping to save those films. He cleaned, I think it was 16 hours of film, and it's equivalent of 6.5 miles of 16mm film. Cleaned it by hand before he transferred it. He filmed it. And here's some of the title screens from a number of those films that we saved. Basically, I already talked about that. Okay, here's a couple of still frames from a couple of those films. Real quick, talk about the fact that this is out at Cider Lake, just outside of town. Just got put on the National Register of Historic Places about 5-6 years ago. Some of the things you can do with say 16mm film are kind of interesting. If the person filming is doing a panorama, you can take those still frames and stitch them together. And I made this real wide panorama of Cinder Lake from that. Another thing you can do is you can sometimes get stereo pairs. They just move the camera slightly, even sometimes turning to do a pan, you can get stereo pairs. Another interesting thing is even if the camera's pointed at one point for a while, you can capture a number of frames. What you can do, again, is add those frames together in the computer. And again, you improve the signal to noise ratio. And this has actually been done with one of the Mars rovers. You can get a much more detailed picture. Now, those aren't really scientific, but they're just kind of interesting things you can do with data. Audio, they had some tapes of the audio of the training exercises they did. I need to follow up on that problem. Last thing I'll probably talk to you about before we run out of time is when the astronauts, to free up their hands, their camera was mounted on their chest. And so everything they did, they had to use their whole body to point. So if they were taking a panorama, they had to get it just right so they didn't get all sky or all land. They're doing a sample, they had to be able to point. So they had to practice that. And they did that out here at Cinder Lake. This is a picture of this mosaic, two-frame mosaic on the bottom. It's taken by Alan Bean of Apollo, later walked on the moon on Apollo 12. Did a panorama. I found these out at the National Archives. And what I find exciting about this is this upper picture. At one point, he turned and he took a picture of Gene Shoemaker out there. So these are the kind of things you can find and I think are important to save. Real quickly, up there at the USGS, they have what I estimated. I did a spreadsheet. I estimate 5,000 to 10,000 still photos that are up there. I know they started digitizing them just a number of years ago, just before COVID. I don't know what happened. Last thing, paper documents, maps, internal documentation, graphs, and so forth. I won't tell this story, we're running out of time, but there's things like gray literature, monthly reports, that's just a table of reports that I can't find. Same thing with annual progress reports, memoranda, memos to people. Put this one in because George Ulrich was a neighbor and he also got me into home brewing. Organizational charts are really handy. Newspaper articles can be handy. Now here's a case where I was told that the Arizona Daily Sun, their archives burned many years ago. But we're able to get some of them because some people cut them out and kept them in scrapbooks. So there is some data there. And I'll tell you, there's lots of good quotes and information to be found sometimes. Here's a really an example which kind of reminds me of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The quality is so bad, I had to really do a lot of processing and read carefully to create some readable text. Okay, in summary, there's newly discovered or newly created data. There's newly recovered data. There's new ways of looking at processing or analyzing old data. And then there's, just as I just covered in the last part of the talk, basically not losing the data, preserving it. So that's my talk. Thank you for coming. And thanks to our sponsors. If you would please consider filling out the survey. Hope I didn't run over too much.
Great, good time. Time for 2 questions. Yeah, bring the microphone.
Going back to
Okay, the Apollo, yeah.
that not be classified? How could that not be intellectual property that the government would definitely want to keep hold of and preserve because we were the first? How could that be lost? I mean, it's insane.
Contact NASA on that. I had a slide that I skipped over, didn't have time. I work for the government. It's sometimes the reputation is well deserved. Good enough for government work. I don't know. I think just in the urgency of the situation, somebody just got lost passing it on to from one part of the agency to another. I can't say exactly. Yes, sir.
A lot of good stuff in there. I think you should make 2 talks out of that. Not just try to squeeze it into one.
Okay, because you'd like to know more about some individual things. Well, I don't know if there's a method for giving feedback, but I'd be happy to. Again, I could talk for a long time about any number of topics.
This would be a good feedback. One thing I'll add to all this is I think a great benefit of the Festival of Science is we get pretty excited to come and learn the science, but at the same time, we see the humanity in the science too. Just hearing about, hey, this is a famous scientist, by the way, that's where I learned the homework. So I think it makes this all accessible. It's very easy to understand suffering through 80 hours in the freezer. We've all done some crazy things. And the things you have to do your work. So big hand, Richardson. Thank you.
I'm Ryan Anderson. I'm a scientist at the U.S. Geological Survey over by Buffalo Park. And I'll be talking for the first 15 minutes or so, giving you a brief overview of the latest from the Curiosity rover, lots of pretty pictures. And then I'll pass the torch to Alicia, and she will give an update on Perseverance and talk a little bit about Mars sample return. So let's go. So just some background, many people will know this, but some might not. So Curiosity's been on Mars for a while, and its goal is to figure out whether Mars was ever habitable. So it's searching for evidence of biological potential, looking at the geology and the geochemistry, looking at the role of the water in the rocks, what happened in Gale Crater, how did water affect the rocks, and also it's measuring the surface radiation for potential future astronauts who will be on the surface. Briefly, background on Gale Crater is it's a big hole in the ground, and it has a big mountain in the middle. And that mountain is made of layered rocks, and geologists love layered rocks. Every time there's a layer, that means something changed. And so there's a lot of changes in the Mars climate stored here in that mountain of layered rocks. So we landed on the floor of the crater where it's relatively flat, and we have been slowly working our way up over the last 13 years through the layers of Mount Sharp. But even the crater floor was super exciting because we landed right on an alluvial fan. We immediately found all sorts of evidence of water. But I'm going to be focusing mostly on the last year or so of the rover rather than trying to recap 13 years of rover activity in 15 minutes. This is what the crater looks like in black and white, looking down from space. And just to give you an idea, here's the mound of layered rock, and here is where the rover landed. And this is our traverse so far. So we landed way up here. This black stripe is sand dunes. On Mars, sand is usually black because Mars has lots of basalt, the same type of rock you would see in Hawaii. So you get these black sands that form these sand dunes. So we had to drive around those. And we found a path through the sand dunes, through a bunch of buttes and mesas, and then we started climbing up the layered rocks here. Spent a lot of time on Vera Rubin Ridge, and then crossing across this trough. This trough was one of the big goals of the mission because we knew from orbit that trough had clay minerals, and clay minerals have water as part of their mineral structure. So we know that they form in water, and we wanted to check those out. But we've long since passed through those. We went up through a sort of a narrow pass here onto what's called the green hue pediment, this sort of fan feature here, and then we drove past the pediment along this ridge. It's kind of hard to see because the rover's traverse follows right along it, but there's a channel carved into the layers of the mound, and that channel is filled with debris from higher on the mound, and then that actually forms a ridge that sticks out on top of this pediment. And so we've been driving up here, and about last year when I gave this talk, we were right about here, right on that channel, taking a look at the rocks there, and we found some really weird stuff there. And so I'll start there. Zooming in a little bit, here you can see a little bit better the channel. You can see it's kind of filled in there. There's a little tiny crater. And these are all buttes of layered rock, just like you'd see in Sedona. You'll see a lot of panoramas in the next few slides, and they'll look awfully familiar even though there's no plants or anything. Turns out eroded layers look like eroded layers no matter where you go. But right around here, we crossed over the stuff that was in the trough, right there. And we found a rock that looked like this. This is a really weird one from about a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago. And when we drove over one of these rocks with the rover, this is what we saw. It cracked open. It was full of pure sulfur, elemental sulfur, which was totally unexpected, totally weird. But one more piece of evidence on the long list of evidence that there was water involved in this crater. It was moving minerals around. It was creating these sulfur deposits and calcium sulfate that we've seen throughout the whole mission. But this was a real surprise. We did not expect to see a big chunk of sulfur. But sometimes it's a good thing to break the rocks. We don't have a rock hammer, so we just run over them with the rover. Luckily, a lot of the rocks in Gale Crater are kind of breakable, so we can just kind of crunch them and see what's inside. We do have the ability to drill into them, but that's a lot of work. It's a lot easier to just drive over them. So from there, we started our traverse. Instead of climbing up the mound, it gets really sort of full of sand dunes, really kind of rough terrain. So instead, we took a detour around this large mesa and over to some interesting stuff in this direction. But before we talk about that, it's panorama time. This whole mission has just been spectacular view after spectacular view. We're climbing up this mountain, and as we climb, we're weaving our way between these mesas, and everywhere we look, there's just geology exposed. And so, I'll show you the pretty pictures, but the real science is coming from when you zoom in, when you take lots of detailed pictures of these, and the geologists, dissect them and figure out what do these layers mean, what's changing, what is captured in this mountain of layered rocks. This is what we're driving across. It's not the smoothest surface, but it's not bad. Our wheels are pretty big. They're beat up, but they still work. So we can make it over this sort of terrain. I thought this was cool. I didn't even know about this when it occurred, but this is a picture taken by the HiRISE camera, which is on a satellite in orbit around Mars. And this is the first picture. That camera has seen the rover on Mars before from space, but it has never before taken a picture of the rover while the rover was moving. And this one was while the rover was driving. And so you can see the rover's tracks across that kind of rough terrain, going across these big, broad, layered rocks. And there's the rover, mid-drive, working its way up the mountain. So this is the area we're in now. So if I go back a couple slides. So we're driving down through here, and then if you go off the screen here, you come on the screen here, and we have entered this area that's called the Boxworks. This is an area that I mapped long ago in grad school and pointed out as like, hey, this is super weird. And we're finally there, and it's super weird. It's these resistant ridges that have formed where the rock was fractured, and something has made the rock there more resistant. So it's eroded around the cracks. So when you have water percolating through the cracks, that water can deposit things in the surrounding rock, strengthening that rock. And then when you're farther from the cracks, the rock is not strengthened and it erodes away. So you get this weird pattern. And so we've been going through this labyrinth of boxwork features, trying to understand more about what has been going on there. And this is the first of a couple of pictures of what it looks like on the ground. And you can kind of see, here's some of those ridges, those crisscrossing ridges. They're not as obvious on the ground, but they're all over the place. And we've been taking close looks at them and trying to understand what the geology is doing. Here's a really nice panorama. I'm going to break it up into 3 pieces because it doesn't do it justice to show it stretched out like this. So here's the left-hand side. You can see in the background, we've got sand dunes and other buttes, just layers upon layers going up everywhere. And here's some more of those boxworks. And so we've been basically driving the rover around, checking them all out from all different angles and trying to understand the geometry and what's been going on with those. And then this is panning over more boxworks here, and then this is the bottom of a really large stack of layers. And we don't have a definitive answer of what is going on with boxworks, other than the general thing that we kind of already knew, which is that the water has gone through and it has strengthened the rock. But there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the rocks here. This is a picture from the ChemCam instrument, which is the instrument that I'm on. And normally that instrument is used to measure the composition, but it also has a camera. And that camera was designed to just see like where did the laser hit. But it's also a really good telescope. And so we use that telescope to take a close look at things that we can't quite see as well with the color cameras. And so we saw this outcrop, and this whole outcrop, you can see the layers, but then on top of the layers, there's this whole other texture. It's sort of like a alligator skin or something. It's these calcium sulfate deposits. This is yet more evidence that water has been through here and has deposited minerals. And here's a close-up from the MOLLE microscopic imager. You can see what these look like. They're these sort of light nodules of white stuff that are in these rocks. Another view from the RMI, the remote micro imager on ChemCam, is of this piece of the boxwork ridges here called Cocotoni. And I'm going to do like a CSI enhance thing, because to get the details, you really need to zoom in. But you can see this whole outcrop is basically made of these nodules. And that's what I'm talking about. When the water goes through, it strengthens the rock by depositing other minerals in there. So you can see there's layers in the rock. But then on top of those layers, there's been this imprint of water coming in and putting extra minerals in there and making these strong nodules that resist erosion. And when you add that all up, you end up with a big ridge. So, okay, going way back in time to early in the mission, this is a picture from the crater floor looking up at Mount Sharp. One of my favorite pictures from the mission. It's beautiful. And I'm showing it to you now because we have now driven kind of up in here. And we have been getting really, really nice views of this bright material. This is what we call the light tone yardangs. It's this sort of strange, really bright white, really rugged stuff that's sitting sort of plastered on the side of the mound. It doesn't really fit in with anything else. But we finally have a really nice view of it. This is not it. This is the NavCam view of it. Kind of blurry, not the greatest, but remember ChemCam has that telescope, and we've been using our telescope to look at it really closely. So we have a really nice mosaic of several observations all put together looking at the light tone yardangs right here. So take a look at this. You can see we're probably not going to be driving our rover on this. It's very treacherous, super sharp points and cliffs. But you can see also in here, in this stretched image, you can see there's some layers in there. And so we can start trying to figure out what's going on with this unit. How did it form? Why is it plastered on the side of the mound? Why is it only there? And so this mosaic just was shared among the team yesterday, and it's really exciting. It's really cool. This thing has been a mystery, again, since I made the map many years ago. And so it's really exciting to see it up close. And I wanted to zoom in even more, because there's this cliff here. It's about 30 meters high. It's about 100 feet high. So it's massive cliff and these beautiful layers exposed that you can't really see very well from orbit, but we're seeing them edge on from the ground. We can see them really well. So I'm really excited to see what we can learn from this now that we're getting this close view. Before we get to my final slides, also, we've been doing a lot of cool stuff with the RMI lately. So this is another cool thing we've been doing. So this is the crater rim. This is the rim of Gale Crater. But we're high enough on the mound now that we can see over it. And so we can actually see the rim of a distant crater about 90 kilometers away. So I did this in Google Earth, very high tech, but we're about there, and we can actually see this. We're in a time of year on Mars where the air is nice and clear, and so we have this beautiful view outside the crater for the first time. And this is what it looks like. It's not the most beautiful, but it's really cool. It's just really far away, and we can actually see the rim of that other crater and where the rocks are eroding down. And we can't see that much detail from that perspective from orbit. Orbit's looking straight down. So we might have better resolution at that distance, but it's looking at a totally different angle. So this is just kind of a cool thing. Very recent, in the last few weeks, we've been taking these pictures. And there's a zoom in on the one of them. So you can see that's that crater rim 90 kilometers away. And then I'll just wrap up with sort of how things are looking right now. This is a mosaic from a few days ago. This is the NavCam, black and white. This is sort of our main eyes to see what's going on around us. We use the color cameras to zoom in and do science, but this is how we sort of see where we are. And so you can see we're on some boxwork ridges. We're still exploring around, studying those. And this is a picture from yesterday. This is about where the rover is right now. You can see the crater rim in the background. It's like doing field work in Sedona. Everywhere you look, it's beautiful. There's lots of geology to understand. And even 13 years on, we're still finding all sorts of exciting things, doing lots of cool science. And we're looking forward to continuing to climb up Mount Sharp and learn more about what's been happening on Mars. So I will stop there and pass the torch over to Alicia. So Brandon was saying
Oh.
you can use this, or we can switch this. I don't know what you prefer. Okay. And then there's this.
Is it on? Now it's on. Can you guys hear me?
And this is the video.
Oh, but I need this one for the. Where's my dog?
Those are just places we stopped. And yeah, I'll be happy to answer questions at the end.
I know where mine is. Oh, perfect. I wasn't sure where that was. Right on. Thank you. Ryan and I are so lucky. We get to sit and look at those pictures. Like, that's our job every day, is to look at those latest pictures of Mars. And I thank you for sharing. I just could sit and look at those all day, and I get to. But on the other rover, so I'm Alicia Vaughan, and I work on Perseverance on the Mastcam-Z instrument. I called this To Mars and Back because I wanted to take the time to explain why sample collection is so important to us. So Perseverance landed in February of 2021. So it's been up there about 4.5 years now. And it is the sample collection rover. The scientific community, has said over and over again, the most important next step for us for Mars is to actually bring rocks back from Mars. So here is Perseverance on the surface in front of the first rock where we collected samples. So there's our two little borehole where we collected cores. I said I worked for Mastcam-Z, had to point that out just so you can see where that is on the rover. That's the instrument that I'm associated with. Okay, so why collect samples? The bottom line is because Mars was habitable. And so Mars today is dry and cold. There isn't any long-term standing liquid water on Mars today. So, something drastic changed in Mars's climate. 3.5 billion years ago, okay? That's how long ago we have to go back to have a habitable Mars. So I wanted to show you the terrestrial kind of biological timeline here to think about how life has evolved on this planet and how we recognize it, right, in fossils. So just to start, when we first have eukaryotes, which are, cells that have nuclei, those show up just over 2 billion years ago, okay? Habitable Mars is further back than that, okay? And then kind of the Cambrian explosion, where life really kind of diversified explodes on the planet, is within the last 750 million years, within the last billion years. So we have to go way back here, past 3 billion, to when we think Mars underwent this change. And my point in bringing this up is if we're looking for evidence for life or biosignatures, what are we looking for? What are we going to expect to find on Mars? Fish fossils and plant fossils? No, nothing like that. We might be so lucky as to find something like this. If anybody is familiar with the stromatolite, this is some of the earliest evidence for life on Earth. Today off the western coast of Australia, from a rock 3.5 billion years ago on Earth from Australia. And these layers here are the evidence for microbial mats. So very simple early life that's interacting with sediment, getting the nutrients it needs from the sediments and metabolizing, and leaves this pattern behind in the rocks. So this is an example of a biosignature from very primitive life on Earth. We would be ecstatic if we found something like this on Mars. That's the kind of thing we're looking for. So let me just tell you that on Earth, that's really tricky, because on Earth, there's only a handful of places that you can actually find rocks that are 3.5 billion years old. And they are these yellow circles. That's it. I meant it. Just a handful of places on the planet you can find rocks this old. Because Earth is very active, right? We have plate tectonics and volcanism and a really active water cycle. Earth's surface is being resurfaced all the time. So we don't have a lot of evidence from early Earth. Mars is different. This is a point in Mars's favor. Mars never had plate tectonics. We have no evidence for that. It hasn't been volcanically active for a while. The water cycle that may have been is long dead. And so actually, like 50% of the surface of Mars is covered in rocks that old. So that's cool. We've got a lot of places we can look on Mars at rocks that are this old from a habitable time. So one problem, though, with Mars is that it's exposed to radiation. So Mars doesn't have the atmosphere, right, to protect it from harmful solar radiation or harmful cosmic radiation. So whatever organic molecules or biomarkers that might be there have been exposed to this kind of radiation for over 3 billion years. So we don't know, would we even recognize it if we found it? This is just a fun diagram to show you about what radiative doses look like. Ryan mentioned that Curiosity is measuring the radiation environment, and a lot of studies have been done for astronauts because we want to know what they're exposed to even when they go on the International Space Station. So radiation doses measured in millisieverts. And for reference here, the blue bar is like a typical abdominal CT scan, how much radiation you're exposed to. And this is a log scale. The yellow bar is what 6 months on the ISS an astronaut experiences. And the red bar is 500 days on the surface of Mars, how much radiation you're exposed to in millisieverts. So think about 3.5 billion years then, or whenever really the atmosphere was lost at Mars. So my whole point in telling you all of this is that if we're going to say we found evidence for life on another planet, the burden of proof for that is very high, right? It's hard to identify, and you need a lot of evidence. You need to be sure. And we can really only do so much with the instrumentation that we put on these rovers. As sophisticated as they are, and as much as we can learn, they can only do so much. So we really must bring samples back for study in Earth's best labs. And the talk before Ryan and I was a great example of how technology changes too. There will be measurements we can make on these samples that we don't even know about yet, right? We're still learning today from the samples we brought back from the moon. So hopefully then I've made the case for why bringing some samples back from Mars is the next big step for us. It's important. And we've never brought anything from Mars, okay? All those spacecraft we sent since the 1960s, right? But nothing's ever come back. So that's an important step, right? Especially if we want to send humans. We better figure out how to get home. All right, so then on to the mission. We landed in Jezero Crater. A lot of you are probably familiar with this. And it's special because this is a big impact crater, 45 kilometers across, that has this channel flowing in that deposited this delta on the western side. And it also has an outflow channel over here to the east that tells us this crater was full of standing water that breached the rim on the eastern side and overflowed. So a lot of water, like Lake Tahoe style water. And there's a gorgeous picture of the Jezero Delta on that wall that I really wish was in my house. But you can look at it some more when we're done. Okay, and then of course, right after we landed, we were able to, scientists, geologists on our mission were able to look at the rocks. This is the cover of Science magazine after we landed, and you can look at the layers and how the architecture in the layers and learn that they are exactly consistent with what we see in deltas on Earth. So we confirmed early on that these rocks were deposited in a delta, and better yet, you could even use the break in slope for those layers, the elevation of that, and you can reconstruct the lake level. So this is the lake level when those rocks were deposited. So more evidence for lots of water on Mars. So every mission has its goals. We always study the geology, and then this rover is special because it's collecting the samples, and we're still looking at habitability and evidence for life. That's our test rover in California with a human for scale, so you can see. They're pretty big. They're like small SUV vehicles, and they're loaded down with a whole bunch of science instruments, which we won't have time to talk about. All right, so here's where we landed. I gotta switch hands. All right, so hopefully you recognize the delta here now. This crater on top is a good marker for your eye to keep your eye on the delta. The star is where we landed, and just like Ryan, the white line is our traverse so far. The blue dot is where we are today, and this green dot is where the little helicopter we took with us, Ingenuity, rests in peace after a very successful mission. It had 72 flights. It was amazing, and there it's forever though. Oh, this way. Okay, so this is the same map You see the delta, but now it's a geologic map, so the different colors are different units, and so that just kind of shows you the geology, the different science campaigns we've been able to go through to collect samples. Again, here's the star where we landed. Here's some statistics for you. We've driven almost 40 kilometers at this point. We have 18 sealed rock cores now in the belly of the rover that are unsealed, which is a new thing we're doing. As we start to run out of tubes, we're keeping a couple open because we might find something better and we might want to switch them out. So that's a new strategy. We've also set down our background cache at 3 Forks. That's this purple dot. That was literally insurance in case the rover were to break down or something would happen, and we don't want the samples trapped in the belly of the rover, so we set down a backup cache that could be returned. So we have 6 sample tubes that are remaining at this point. So where we landed, right on the border here of this green and brown unit, that was on the crater floor. So here is the kind of the sample collection from there. And when we take a sample, what we do is we first scratch a little window into the rock. We abrade so that we have a fresh surface. It's like a few millimeters deep into the rock. So we're not looking at the weathered face of the rock, but we can actually look at a fresh surface. And then we take all of our instruments on board and put them to work on that little window into the rock. So we get as much as we can with the instruments we have on board about the samples we're going to collect. So we have all this context. So what you see is an abrasion patch and then 2 samples. An abrasion patch, 2 samples. And the sample tubes, the samples we collect are about as big as your pinky. Okay? They're only about a centimeter across and 8 to 9 millimeters long. And so these are pictures of the top of the sample inside the tube. So here you can see like individual mineral crystals and stuff. This is the star where we landed, and these red circles are where we took samples in those first 2 units. So these are igneous rocks, not a habitable environment. If you remember in, your rock cycle, your rock types, igneous rocks are the ones that cool from a magma or a lava. This is not a habitable environment. But it is important. It helps us, we can use these for accurate age dating and help us put constraints on the whole system within Jezero crater. We can also use them to study the magnetic field, which is no more. And then, okay, over to the fan front, which is where we set down the cache, which I'm going to show you, but that's also where we are looking edge on at the layers making up this delta. So when we're at the bottom, right, we can see each of the layers making up the delta, and we climbed our way through there collecting samples. But here is the cache where that purple dot was, where we set down a bunch of tubes for backup so that they could be retrieved someday. And they're literally just sitting out there on the surface. And this is another one of those great panoramas where you could zoom in forever. You could actually see each tube here on the surface. I love this too because it's a good look at fresh rover tracks and rover tracks that are like 3 weeks old. See how much redder the older tracks are and how quickly the global red fine dust of Mars kind of fills them in. So there are 10 tubes sitting out there that could be brought back. Here's pictures of each of them. There they sit. And then we carry the rest with us. We have them in the belly of the rover. So then we climbed up onto the top of the fan and collected samples there. So here's the combination of everything. Down here are all the samples that were from the layers making up the delta. And then we got on top and we collected 2 more here. We also had 1 soil sample that we collected at the bottom. So these are exciting because this is a habitable environment, right? This is what we came for. This is formed by flowing water. So the samples at the top here, they're the top, so they're the youngest. So they record the last stages of water activity in Jezero crater. So they're sandstones and conglomerates that are important because they're the last stages of the aqueous activity. And the layers from the bottom are really fine-grained mudstones that were deposited in that Jezero lake, settled out of, calmer water. So that's an important set of samples, telling us all about the kind of watery past of Jezero crater. And then we went into the margin unit, which is this green unit, and it's called the margin unit because it literally sits in between the rim and the fan. Clever name. All right, so this, oh, fix it. The margin unit samples are these three here. They are olivine and carbonate rich, carbonate precipitating out of water. They were probably igneous to start with, even probably deposited in an igneous process, but may have been reworked into some sedimentary facies where there's more carbonate and the grains look rounded. And people think it could have been a shoreline environment over here next to the lake. And that's still a topic of debate amongst our team. Couple papers coming out about this, but we have the samples, and it is older than the fan. It underlies the fan. So again, we're going to have samples that build up this whole history where we can put the story together really well for this habitable environment. So this is the channel that flows into the crater that made it. And we looked at this right outcrop here and collected samples at higher. And this is the most exciting one in terms of biology. It's the best example of a potential biosignature. And maybe you saw in the news a couple weeks ago, it was a big press release by NASA, big teleconference around a paper that just came out about this sample. So I'm excited to tell you the details about that. Here is the rover sitting in front of where we took that sample. This is the hole. There's the abrasion patch. So this is that unit that's inside Nerevivalis. And when we zoom way in on this rock, this is what we see. And before I break down the textures here that are so exciting, I want to tell you about a biosignature, because our team has spent so much time thinking about this language. The language is important to get it right, you know, and manage people's expectations, essentially. But a biosignature is any phenomenon in which biological processes are a known possible explanation and whose potential abiotic causes have been reasonably explored and ruled out. That's an important piece to understand, is that yes, it could be biological, and we've looked at all the other possibilities for not biology, and we've ruled those out. That's an important piece. And then potential biosignature means, yeah, it could have a biological origin, but we really need more data, further study, i.e. bring this back to Earth, to rule out the presence of life or not. What's exciting about this rock? This is just a big old olivine crystal. That's fine. It's incorporated in this that comes after the rock is deposited with water. Very fine-grained red that is full of organic carbon. And this is a mudstone, very fine-grained. It formed in quiet water at low temperatures in that channel. And then if you see all these little dark spots in here, these are iron phosphate nodules, which is very exciting to astrobiologists because phosphate is an important mineral in biology. And then we have these features all scattered throughout, which a team calls leopard spots, because they look like leopard spots, and that's not a scientific term. But the iron phosphate mineral is the nodules, but the inside are reduced cores. You can see they're lighter toned. The iron has been reduced. The cores are made of iron sulfide minerals, and they're enriched in nickel and zinc compared to the rock around it. So that's a reaction front that when we see that texture and that combination of chemistry and minerals on Earth, that's microbes. It's metabolizing microbes that are causing that reaction front. So that textural and mineralogical evidence is consistent with reactions that are enabled by microbes. And actually, our team found this sample a year ago and has spent the last year looking at everything, dissecting this data, looking at every possibility to explain this that doesn't involve biology, and really having a hard time. So the next step in science is to put that out for peer review, right? That's how science works. So they said, here's our data. They put it out there for all the experts to have a look at, and it was accepted. So that's what the teleconference and all the press was about last week, was that this paper just came out. So the scientific community has accepted that we have, you know, what we think is the best example of a biosignature, and we really struggle to explain this without biology. That's pretty exciting. but we need to bring it back to Earth to be sure. So now we're in the crater rim for the last year or so, which is actually the part I'm most excited about. We have climbed up out of this big Jezero impact crater that we're in. And so we have crested the rim, the highest point, and we're kind of coming down the backside now. But these samples are exciting because this is before the Jezero impact, pre-Jezero, and this is in the Noachian crust of Mars, the oldest geologic age. So regardless of whether these are habitable environments, this is a time on Mars when that climate was different. Earliest Mars, over 3.5 billion years ago. And no other spacecraft has landed and been able to explore in the Noachian crust of Mars before. So it's pretty exciting. Here's a collection of some of the samples we've collected here. That's just a close-up view. So these are 3.5 billion year old rocks you're looking at here. Pretty exciting. And there's lots of diverse minerals. We have a really compelling and diverse suite of samples from Mars that, if we were able to bring them back, will help us answer some really fundamental science questions about Mars that are still lingering. You know, was it inhabited or not? Was there life? And what do prebiotic environments look like on planets, even if life did not arise? You know, we're going to learn a lot more about how the climate evolved over time, and more about the history of the Martian magnetic field. To time constrain these all better because we can get age dates on those samples. So bring them home. And so sample return, TBD. I wish I had better news, but it does have design architecture. It's a partnership between NASA and ESA. Being reworked some of the details, and then it got canceled with the budget. And now both houses have reinstated NASA science to some degree. One house has called out Mars sample return, the other hasn't. We don't know. Whether it's this administration or a future one, it would be fantastic to get these samples back. And then because we're at Lowell, I had to show you that we do astronomy from Mars too. On the left is Deimos in front of the sun. Deimos is one of Mars's moons. It's the tinier moon, and it's further out, so it looks like a black speck in front of the sun. And on the right is a movie of the moon Phobos passing in front of the sun. Phobos is the larger moon of Mars, and it's closer in. So we do lots of fun things with these rovers, and there's just, you can't talk about all of it. And this is our road ahead. This is looking off to the west, and we are at a high point coming down the crater rim. And we're going to continue driving out here into the, earliest stages of Mars that are represented in these rocks, which is exciting. And because this is very recent, and as Ryan was saying, right now the viewing on Mars is really good because it's like the clearest skies seasonally. And so this mountain is 85 kilometers away, which is pretty cool. And finally, you can't give a Mars talk and not show dust devils because that's the most happening thing on Mars. They happen all the time in our images, and we can't help but catch them. It's constant. So thanks for listening. And we're supposed to thank our sponsors for continuing to support the festival and ask folks to take the survey. And I think we have time for questions. Thank you.
Any questions? All right.
Very good. Male half. I don't know your name, so I can't address you.
Ryan.
You mentioned several times things were weird. And I just, I realized by that you meant something was unusual, but unusual in comparison to what? And I need you to explain what weird means. And then the second question to female, Alicia. The sample collection kind of mystified me. I assumed you were keeping everything on the rover. Eventually, somebody would find the rover. But I was reminded of Hansel and Gretel fairy tale. You're just dropping these things as you
No, we are not. No. Yeah.
Before you answer,
Mhm.
our viewers at home couldn't hear the question, so if you could repeat the question when you answer, and harder, the microphone for the video camera.
Okay, got it. Double.
Sorry to make it hard.
We aren't dropping the samples as we go. We set down a backup cache of selected half of the ones that we had to date from the Delta. And we set those on the ground for insurance, essentially. In case the rover were to break down, we wouldn't want the samples to be trapped inside the belly of the rover. So that is just a backup cache for insurance purposes. And the main cache is in the belly of the rover, and the intention is to hand those off to whatever's coming to get them.
Okay. And the other part of the question was, what do I mean when I say things are weird? I mean, they're not expected. So you don't expect when you're driving around in a riverbed to come across a chunk of solid sulfur. I've never seen that on Earth. I don't know what caused that. You think of solid sulfur as a volcanic vent, but Gale Crater is volcanic. So that sulfur was probably mobilized by water and deposited there is kind of the guess, but I don't know if we have an answer. Likewise, seeing fractures that are more resistant to erosion than their surroundings is not biology, but why are they there? Why are they at that level of Mount Sharp? Why not higher? Why not lower? What caused the fractures and what caused the fluids to go through them and what minerals were deposited? I like to say the closer you look at Mars, the weirder it gets. These are just examples. As you get down on the ground, you find things that you were expecting, like the fractures, but then you look at them and they're covered in these nodules or things like that, or you find things that you had no way of expecting at all, like a big block of sulfur. That's what I mean. Okay, yeah, I'm moving it around.
First, I'd like to thank you for all the support. Question for Ryan and a question for Lisa. Ryan, the process of driving over rocks to crush them, that part of the original plan or something that was different? And the question for Alicia, still stuck on these samples, so similar. And for the ones that dropped off, it appeared almost random that you sprinkled them around. Would it have been simpler to put them all in one location so when you come to retrieve them, whatever robot you send down to retrieve them, right, would scoop them up? So if the two of you can comment on those, I'd really appreciate it.
Okay, I'll go first. So the first question.
Thank you. What the first question was.
Whether it was intentional.
Yeah. Oh. Okay. The question is, was it intentional to drive over the rock and crush it, or what? So sometimes it's intentional, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes you just get lucky, and you drive over something, and you turn around and say, "Holy cow! Look what was inside it." And other times you see. I don't remember what the circumstance was for this one, but sometimes you see, maybe you just nick one and you say, "Hey, that looks kind of weird. Let's deliberately go back and kind of crush it and see what we get." And I don't remember if that sulfur one was on purpose or not. Okay, this microphone is really touchy. I don't remember if that sulfur one was deliberate or not, but we do both. It's sometimes just an accident and sometimes deliberate.
That was always the plan, to set down a backup cache. So we took 2 samples of everything for the first, through the Delta front of collection, we took 2 of everything so that we could then set half of them down. And that was always the plan, to set down a backup cache and then carry the main cache with the rover. And then they are spread out on purpose, because I think in thinking about all the possible designs for what is going to come and get them, I think the main idea was some kind of robotic arm that would know the dimensions of the tube. Then you need them spaced out enough for whatever to maneuver to get them. So that was all engineered for sure, and the plan.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions. I'm going to ask that it's just one question. Greg does not get to ask a question.
I have to.
Yeah.
You showed a family portrait of Rovers. The granddad of those is the Viking.
Lander.
It's not a Rover.
Right.
And there was some peculiar data came from it with their life tests. Where they thought they found evidence of life, but then when they looked with the mass spec, there was nothing there. Has that ever been explained?
Oh.
What is the surface chemistry of Mars that would do that? Is that
Yeah, that's a good question.
Okay, so the question was about going way back to Viking. There were experiments to try to find life on Mars. Viking were the landers in the 70s. And one of the experiments seemed to show evidence of metabolism, but then the other experiments didn't. I'm not an astrobiologist, so asterisk on all of this, but my understanding is that with the discovery of perchlorate by the Phoenix lander, perchlorate is a highly reactive molecule that releases oxygen when it gets wet. And so if you dump water and whatever was in that experiment onto soil that's rich in perchlorate, you're going to get what appears to be metabolism, but it's actually just perchlorate breaking down and giving off oxygen. So that's my understanding of where we are on the Viking situation.
I have one more online question real quick. One online question from Susan Wall. How much space is in the belly of the rover, and is it running out of space for any more supplies?
Repeat that.
Put a slide in to help you visualize. There's like a whole robot inside a robot. There's a separate robotic arm underneath in the belly that manages the samples and runs them through all your stations to measure the volume, et cetera. So they are all stored. There's 42 tubes. We had a finite number that we took with our sample section. We have 6 left that we can fill. We have 2 that are unsealed. So if we found something fantastically exciting, we can potentially dump one and fill that tube with something better. But that's where they're stored under the belly.
Speak.
Yeah,
Okay, so Ryan, in your very first slide, you mentioned that there's measures the radiation environment that's really important for future astronaut exploration. And you also mentioned, Alicia, that measuring the radiation environment is important for understanding what the environment's like for the potential of human exploration of Mars. Do you happen to know anyone or have any scientific colleagues that might actually get to go to Mars someday?
Yes, so we're laughing because Greg is asking this because we found out yesterday that our colleague at astrogeology, Lauren Edgar, has been selected as an astronaut. And so, astronaut candidate, but that just means she has to do a bunch of things and then she's going to go into space. So our friend who worked on the rovers for many years with us is now an astronaut and maybe will Mars someday. We're all very excited about that.
All right, that's really amazing. Thank you for the survey slide up. We have another talk coming in about 5 minutes on the Dragon Bravo fire. Not a really good segue other than fire can be red, and this was a red planet. But I do want all of you, again, to take the survey, give us some feedback. If you have downloaded the festival app, please do so. Hopefully Ryan and Alicia can be around for a few minutes while we have the break between the speakers. But again, thank you for attending the Festival of Science. We have all the way through Sunday of a bunch of
Right hand, okay, no. Take it away. All right. Thank you so much for being here. Do you know how hard it is to follow Mars in a presentation? I mean, is there anything more exciting, well, than being in this new facility and hearing about Mars Rover? This is very fuzzy, the audio. Not sure what's causing that, but anyway, it is so exciting to be here and to be amongst all of this science which is going on. My name is Brian Klimowski. I'm the meteorologist in charge, National Weather Service here in Flagstaff, Arizona. I've served in this capacity for 23 years. How about that? There we go. We'll see. We'll hope that takes care of the static. Anyway, super exciting to be here. Like I said, I've been served as the meteorologist in charge for 23 years at the National Weather Service here in Flagstaff. What an honor that has been. We've seen a lot of weather over the past 23 years. I've been involved with multiple large wildfires, tornado outbreaks, flash floods, you name it. We've seen it in the past 20 years, but today I'm going to be talking about something, well, rather special, rather difficult for a lot of us. That is the Dragon Bravo fire. On July 3rd, 2025, about 3:25 p.m., a single lightning strike set into motion what was to become one of the largest wildfires in Arizona history. Over the subsequent weeks that followed, the Dragon Bravo fire grew explosively, fueled by record dry forests and an atmosphere that, quite frankly, was just primed for fire. It was going to happen. What we're going to talk about today is, we're going to talk about that story. We're going to go into some of the people behind that story and a lot of the science that kind of drove this fire to its extreme behavior. Are you ready to get started? Yes. All right, let's do this. All right. Can we do something about this static? I guess we're going to live with it for now. All right. So the story began with one lightning strike on July 3rd, 2025. It's a part of this little handful of lightning strikes that occurred on a very normal early monsoon day. Nothing special about the day, just random convection across the area. We had 6,500 lightning strokes that day. That means individual electrical discharges, which accounted for about 2,000 to 3,000 lightning bolts, as they might appear visually. A very average day. What we've mapped here is all the lightning on that day. That's a very average day. We see a lot of lightning in northern Arizona. If this is a very average day, and our monsoon typically lasts about 8 weeks or so. Anyway, this is what the radar reflectivity looked like on the day that the Dragon Bravo fire began. Just very low reflectivity, scattered showers. Some of these were very electrical, some, as in this little storm here, not that electrical at all. Sent out a handful of lightning bolts. That was it. That's what started our fire and started our story. But this was early in the monsoon, which means very special conditions were present. Forest fuels are dry. We all know what June is typically like here, correct? It's hot, dry, breezy. It's our fire season. Widespread monsoon precipitation had not occurred yet. Like I just said, temperatures are hot, days are very long early in July, and lightning strikes from thunderstorms start fires. Many of them are put out by subsequent rain. Many of them don't take hold because it's already pretty moist in the soils. Unfortunately, some of them do take hold. The Lightning Bravo fire was discovered or first detected the next day on July 4th in the afternoon. What it became was, well, quite a monster. This was actually filmed by the Incident Management Team 2, I think on August 29th. And we saw some extreme pyrocumulus forming above the firehead as it was advancing very rapidly to the northeast. Now, what is a pyrocumulus? We kind of throw that term around, and it's pretty popular right now, but what it is it is an actual cloud which is being formed from the heat generated by the fire as it thrusts very rapid updrafts into the atmosphere, cooling and condensing into water droplets into a cloud. Now, why are pyrocumulus clouds significant in wildfires, and why are they so dangerous? They're dangerous because a pyrocumulus cloud is basically a thunderstorm, or it can be a thunderstorm above a fire. And what do we know about thunderstorms? They can cause downdrafts, strong erratic winds. They're associated with very strong updrafts, so it helps encourage fire behavior, which can become very extreme. Within those updrafts, you can get some of the burn material, the ash, sticks, things that are burning, lofted very high into the atmosphere, and then carried by the wind far in front of the burning front of the fire, causing long-range spotting. So pyrocumulus, you don't want to see. We had some very aggressive pyrocumulus on this fire. And let's move on. There we go. All right. The Dragon Bravo ended up being the 7th largest wildfire in Arizona history. As of this morning, it wasn't officially 100% contained yet. It's been hanging out at 94% containment for a week or two at 145,504 acres. Of course, most noteworthy, about 106 structures were severely damaged or destroyed by the fire, and a lot of structural impacts as well to the North Rim and the North Rim area. Now, of course, we live in an area of frequent wildfire. You just have to look out your window at the mountains to see evidence of wildfire. Is that right? We can name 3 right off the top of our heads, can't we? Schultz Fire, Pipeline, and Museum, right? All in the past 15 years, all in San Francisco peaks. But there's been multiple fires across northern Arizona, of course, over the past 10, 15 years, and throughout our history. Our forest is, in a sense, made to burn. Ponderosa pine forests have this kind of symbiotic relationship with fire, with elevated crowns that typically don't burn, with low-intensity ground fires, thick bark. It's actually well adapted to wildfire, especially frequent low-intensity fires. But the Dragon Bravo fire was anything but that. So as we move through the talk, it'll be good to have in your back pocket the ingredients for fire behavior, those components that come together that can feed very active fire behavior. Of course, one of the first ones is weather. Of course, there's weather which is conducive to burning and weather which is not conducive to burning. When you think of wildfire weather, you think of hot, you think of dry, you think of windy. Okay, these are features of the weather that will promote rapid fire growth. Wet, cold, and calm basically can put a fire out, or at least make sure that it never gets started. The other component is fuel. What is burning? Okay, very important component, because if you have a lightning strike or if you try to manually start a fire with wet fuel or wet timber, it's just not going to burn, is it? It's just going to smolder and nothing's going to happen. Dry fuels are the key, is the tinderbox for a wildfire and can promote its growth. And what we saw in the Dragon Bravo fire were fuels that started out in a relatively normal state in early July. Not that different from normal, but the lack of the monsoon, the heat, and the persistent, strong, dry winds we had very rapidly dried the fuels to an extreme state and eventually to record high levels across the North Kaibab forest. Topography also plays a large part in fire activity. If you have the wind blowing up a steep slope and a forest that's continuous up that slope, fire will rapidly accelerate up that slope because heat rises, and it just feeds that fire as it rises higher and higher across the slope. Flat surfaces don't burn necessarily as fast unless they're fueled by strong wind. Okay? Downsloping can have other interesting effects. If you have a fire front that might interact with a very steep downhill aspect, you can have trees that burn up on top, fall down, and you have burning logs that then roll down the slope, ignite fires that burn back up the slope. An extremely dangerous situation, extremely dangerous. The fourth part of this is a trigger. You need a trigger to start a fire. You need a match. You need something. In our case, it was lightning. Statistically, lightning starts about 15% of the total number of wildfires. Okay, 15%. The other 85%, human caused. Okay, it's not the same ratio if you look at total acres burned. Okay, if you look at total acres burned, lightning starts to count for a greater proportion than human caused fires, because many human caused fires are in areas, well, where people are, and you have an opportunity to put them out quick. All right, so let's talk about fire progression, okay? This is a great image that was created that shows the progression of the fire from the lightning start right here as it progressed through the 145,000 acres. And let me walk you through essentially what you're seeing. Very roughly, in blue is the first week of the fire, where it was initiated here, moved to the east, and then to the south toward the North Rim structures. The second week is basically in green, as it moved up to the north and east, came across the Forest Service boundary where they had a very solid line set, and it eked down here into the desert just a little bit too. So second week basically in green. The third week was the very rapid and extreme burning that happened in the third week of the event. That's everything in yellow there. Fourth week basically in red. This fire progression map stops on August 9th. That's when the bulk of the area was burned. What we're going to look at today is basically that first week and the third week that caused the extensive damage to the North Rim, and it caused over 82,000 acres to burn in just 4.5 days, late in July. Let's get started. But first, let's talk about fire intensity and burn intensity. Very important to talk about because burn intensity kind of governs the flood response we're going to see. We use some really cool satellite imagery to take a first crack at what the burn intensity is. And what you're looking at here is everywhere in red in this satellite image was burned, okay? Where it's the brightest red, most of the foliage, or the foliage is burned more completely or more intently. Where it's more black, less so, and where it's still green, there was barely any burning at all. So the way we determine soil burn intensity is we first give it a satellite estimate, and then we send what's called a BEAR team in. This is the Burn Area Emergency Response Team that goes in as soon as they can after the fire has cooled down so they can evaluate and verify what the burn intensity is, okay? We just can't take what the satellite gives us on a whole because there's a lot of variables that goes into calculating burn intensity. And since we're on the topic, let's just talk about burn intensity a little bit and soil burn intensity. It's evaluated on a number of factors, but the four main ones is how much of the ground cover is remaining. That is, how many pine needles, small sticks, or pine cones duff might still be remaining on the surface. That's one. If you see a lot, low burn severity. In moderate burn severity, you'll see maybe 50 to 60% of all of the surface material is burned off into ash. Okay, there is not much remaining, but it is still there. Okay, you can see that the soil structure has started to diminish with moderate burn severity, and water is slightly repellent, like you pour water on it and it half soaks in and half kind of runs off. High burn intensity is when there is nothing left on the surface except ash. There's little, if anything, left on the trees except the main trunks. And water is extremely repellent. You pour it on, it just runs right off. Hence, why flash floods are such a threat after a wildfire burn, as we're well aware with our local fires. So here's just some examples. These are not from the Dragon Bravo. These are from other fires, actually in a manual on how to evaluate burn intensity. But low burn intensity, showing a lot of materials still exists. For medium intensity, you still have some structure to the trees and branches, and then high intensity burn. You're just looking at toothpicks. Okay? So the next image you're going to see will be the official burn intensity map from the Dragon Bravo fire. And here's what we have. We have very low or low burn severity at about 72% of the area. Moderate burn severity in yellow at 26%, high burn severity at 2%. Now understand the distinction here. This is soil burn intensity, not percent of trees burned, okay? Very different here. But it shows you, and it gives us as meteorologists an indication of which areas might be most prone to flash flooding, which drainages will have to be most sensitive to. And it kind of provides a map of how intensely the fire burned. You'll notice that where the fire burned most quickly and most intently, especially up here between July 27th and the 30th, was high intensity burn mixed in with moderate intensity. Well, we saw that pyrocumulus. This was the area that was burning underneath that. Now, I'm a curious guy, and I always want to compare things. I guess that's what scientists do. So I looked at the burn intensity percentages for a couple other fires I think we're all familiar with, or might be. I'm comparing it here to the Rodeo Chetiskyi fire and the pipeline fire. And you'll see that the percentages of high burn intensity, moderate burn intensity, low, and very low are actually among the same order, okay? The Dragon Bravo fire is in blue, Rodeo Chetiskyi in green, and pipeline fire is in yellow. Now there is a big standout fire, and it's a fire which leveraged topography in its burn intensity a lot. Know which fire that might be? Schultz. The burn intensity on the Schultz fire was 40% high, soil burn intensity. And you want to know why we had such a massive flood response on the east side of Flagstaff after the Schultz fire? There it is. We had a very thick forest that hadn't burned for at least a century or been logged for a century. High density, burning up the very steep slopes of the San Francisco peaks. Was anybody here during the Schultz fire? Do you remember that Sunday morning and turning north and seeing that huge plume? That's how gut-wrenching that was. That was quite an event. All right, so let's talk about the first of these 2-week periods we're going to look at closely. The first one here is the days from July 11th through 13th. Remember, the fire started on July 3rd, first detected on July 4th. By July 9th, it was about 59 acres, but things changed very rapidly as the weather changed very rapidly. We had a little bit of moisture on July 2nd and 3rd. That's where that lightning strike came from. Then things dried out significantly and several weather factors came into play. Here's the fire perimeter on July 9th, 59 acres. By July 11th, 941 acres. Look at the next day, July 12th, 3,471 acres. And July 13th, 4,609. Most of the damage on the North Rim was late, very late on July 12th. Okay. We have here. What we have here is something very interesting. We have the, sorry about that. See if I can do this right. What you're going to see is 3 days of the Dragon Bravo fire on July 11th, 12th, and 13th. Okay, 3 days. You're going to see a smoke plume start, get excited, then it'll go really low again, come back, go low again, and come back. 3 days of the Dragon Bravo fire in satellite. Let's see if I can do this one more time. Okay, so what we see here is the first conflagration on the 11th. On the 12th, you see a wind shift. Things are coming from the south, from the north to the south. Same thing on the 13th. We're going to look at that again. Okay, you'll see the first day, which is July 11th, the fire starts out relatively calm and then blows up significantly on the 11th. On the 12th, you'll notice the smoke plume is moving to the south from northerly winds. We had a wind shift. Same thing on the 13th. Okay, so this is the 11th, and it blows up. 12th, winds coming out of the north. 13th, winds coming out of the north. But you'll notice, see, the Dragon Bravo is right here. There's another big fire out there, isn't there? Which one was that? White Sage. That's right, that was the White Sage fire. And it blew up during these initial days as well. Actually, when the Dragon Bravo grew 4,000 acres, by July 13th, the White Sage fire grew 40,000 acres. Okay, very volatile situation out there. Okay, let's get past this. So, antecedent conditions, just very briefly. As we know, last winter was very light up on the North Kaibab, less than 50% of the snowfall of normal, very warm conditions in May, June. And July helped to dry things out. June actually started out real wet, as you can remember. Pretty darn wet. Actually, the North Rim, some stations had well over average precipitation in early June. But by early July, fuels were getting critically dry. The precipitation turned off on July 4th, and things dried out very quick. And you know what is one of the stronger points of this presentation is the monsoon never did really kick in to put out this fire as it should have, but it did not. So let's look at some charts. As a scientist, I love charts. You know, this is kind of a blinding array of lines, so just focus on two, if you may. One is the black line in each one, and maybe the gray line, which lies underneath. On the left, we have what's called the burning index. It's a scientific parameter which basically says how intense could the fire be? How intense could it be? On the right is the vapor pressure deficit. Basically, it's the atmospheric drying power. It's how dry the atmosphere is and how the winds and dryness might drive further drying of the ground. And what we see here is in the how intense the fires could be, starting out in April, May, and into June, guess what? It's just pretty normal. the fuels are curing pretty normally. We had the big wet June here, which dropped the potential for fire ignitions and intense fire behavior very low. Then it increased back up to normal, but to a critical level, which is typical of late June, early July. Then we had the weak storms on July 3rd and 4th, which caused the lightning strike that started the fire, and then things dried out very rapidly and actually got well above normal, which is normally decreasing at this time. On the vapor pressure deficit, or how dry is the atmosphere and how might it drive drying of the fuels, you'll see that after that rainfall in in July, it skyrocketed. We had a very dry air mass in place with extraordinary drying of the fuels right after that lightning strike. Okay, let's look at a couple more common parameters like temperature. This is the temperature of the Bright Angel Station, which was not far from the North Rim. And the lightning ignited the fire here. This is the high temperatures on July 4th, low temperatures July 5th, 6th, 7th. See how this is progressing. This is an average high temperature, which is around 78 at this time. You can see that it got very hot very soon after lightning started the fire. And then even hotter, got up to almost 90 degrees at 8,100 feet. Okay, 8,100 feet. The rapid growth from late on July 10th through the 13th happened in this period. Some very important factors here. Look at the low temperatures at night and what's not happening. It's not cooling off. Okay, we have enough winds in place, and actually some downsloping at this time, which is keeping the low temperatures near 70 degrees. Is that going to inhibit fire behavior? No, that fire is going to run day and night because we're not cooling off significantly. Actually, our low temperatures on July 11th and 12th are near the average high temperatures for that date. Phenomenal. Let's look at relative humidity. When the storms initiated the fire here, pretty average signature that we see with the relative humidities falling and rising between, let's say, 20-30% to 60-70%. Some dry westerly flow begins as the monsoon circulation is pushed to our east, and the relative humidity does not go above 30% and falls below 20% and even 10% in some locations as we get into this period of rapid fire growth late on July 10th through July 13th. These are exceptionally low relative humidity levels, exceptionally low. We're talking relative humidities down to 5% with temperatures near 90 degrees. We had near record highs at this time and extreme heat warnings going on in the Grand Canyon for this heat. The dryness was exceptional. So what was happening? Fuels were drying extraordinarily fast, just as this fire was taking root. Okay, one other factor that goes into this is we had a dry trough pass through, basically a front from the northwest. It swept through on July 11th, and by late on July 12th, the wind direction had changed to a more northerly, northwesterly direction. Unfortunately, that's a very critical factor to the fire growth at this time. Because as we know, it took the fire front from a location that was north of a lot of the infrastructure on the North Rim and just dialed it right in to the North Rim late on the 12th. A lot of complicating factors on July 12th, and I won't get into that at this time, but we'll talk about the meteorology and the rapid fire growth from the 10th through the 13th that consumed the North Rim. We had winds shifting to the northwest, measured to about 20 miles an hour, but observed boots on the ground about 40 miles an hour. Understand we're dealing with very complex topography, and northerly winds on the North Rim are actually downsloping and funneling through some of the North Rim canyons there, leading to erratic winds and extreme fire behavior. We had extremely low relative humidities, especially from July 10th on. Fuels dried rapidly. We saw that in the burning index. That's a reflection of fuel dryness. And the topography, the steep canyon terrain accelerated the upslope spread and erratic, unpredictable fire movement. And wind amplification and funneling was likely going on at that time in this area of very complex topography. The next week, okay, after July 12th and 13th, we had a return of some, pretty, I'll just say average weather for the monsoon. We didn't have any rain, but we didn't really have a dramatic shift of the winds. We had a return to our normal kind of southwesterly flow. But you get toward the third week in July and things changed again. We had a trough, that is low pressure, set up over the west coast, okay? That pushed the monsoon moisture all to the east and kept us under this persistent, dry southwest flow. It was irritating as heck to us meteorologists because we love to see, weather. We love to see our monsoon that we love and that precipitation and the moisture. But that trough was pushing all the moisture to our east. New Mexico was very wet this year, but we were very dry. And those southwesterly winds that came up pushed the fire through 82,000 acres in about 4.5 days. And let's just briefly look at some of the weather parameters associated with that. But first, we're going to look at some satellite imagery, but this is very special satellite imagery. What you're about to see is the reflection of the burning front of the fire in satellite imagery, okay? You'll see it over about 5 days, advancing through this period from like July 24th through July 31st, when it expanded about 80,000 acres. This is one of the tools that we use to identify where the hot spots are in a fire, when especially we can't have overflights, maybe perhaps because the fire is burning too hot. But it gives us kind of a continual measure of the fire intensity and the burning front. So let me show you that real quick. So you see on July 24th, the burning front was here, then it just exploded to the north over those couple days. And you'll see how fires burn on the edges and push out. Let's look at that one more time. Fascinating new imagery that we get, but you can see that in about a 3-day period, boom, 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 it just races toward the north as it's fueled by these persistent southwest winds and southerly winds. An air mass that actually reaches record dry levels, and the fuels that continue to dry even more. Some amazing statistics about the Dragon Bravo fire at this time, which we'll look at very briefly. Okay, first one is the precipitable water in the atmosphere. Now that's a fancy term for saying, if we took a column of air above our heads and squeezed out all the moisture, how much would you have? Okay, our balloon launches or radiosondes measure that twice a day. So I went ahead and plotted that on this graph from basically July 1st all the way through the end of August. I put what would be the normal values here in blue and shaded the two areas of explosive growth that between July 11th and 13th and July 24th through August 1st here. And you'll notice a couple of things. Absolutely extraordinarily low values of precipitable water in the atmosphere as measured from our weather balloon. And in this period, it is absolutely phenomenal. These values here are actually record dries. We've never had values that low during this time of year in the middle of the monsoon when it should be wet and moist. It should be wet and moist, but it's as dry as it's ever been for that time of year. An extraordinarily plot, and these values tell a lot of the story. Let's look at some more of the parameters. This is the mean surface mixing ratio, or the moisture content at the south rim of the canyon, a place we can easily measure it. And you'll see that the highest and lowest values are outlined in gray, the median is in blue, and you'll see in this period in late July, when the fire grew 82,000 acres, the moisture content was at its record lowest at one point, which was on the south rim of the Grand Canyon. So the north rim was probably very similar. Absolutely extraordinary. That trough over the west coast looked like this. If you like monsoon moisture, you do not like this weather pattern because it feeds dry air off the cool Pacific over northern Arizona and keeps our kind of monsoon circulation pushed well to the east. We saw this on multiple days in late July and early August. It resulted in strong winds, red flag warning criteria, which is, by the way, you've probably heard the term red flag warning when paired with fire weather. For us in northern Arizona, it's for when we can forecast conditions of winds in excess, sustained winds in excess of 20 miles an hour, wind gusts over 35 miles an hour, relative humidities below 15%, and high fire danger. Basically, when all those come together, we can issue a red flag warning. And we had local red flag warning conditions on several days during this period. Another interesting graph. What we're looking at here is the average high temperatures through about a 6-week period from the 1st of July to 20th of August, and then summarizing it in a single bar. So in 2025, the average high temperature through that period was, over 87 degrees through that period. What I've done is I've run this back through time and looked at similar periods all the way back from 1970 all the way through 2020. This is also at the South Rim station that I used for the previous one. And you'll see that that period where the fire grew so much, it was the 4th hottest on record through that period. And you'll probably see a trend in that graph as well, going up. Yeah, things are getting warmer. No mystery there. Burning index, vapor pressure deficit for this latter part of the fire growth was record. The burning index got to record high levels. It's never been this high in late July and early August. It reached, what is that? Over the 95th percentile, which is the potential for extreme fire behavior. Fuels extremely dry. It's exactly what we saw. The vapor pressure deficit showed the same trends. But a remarkable statistic is that from July 5th through August 15th, the rainfall at Bright Angel is normally about 3 inches. Okay, this is from the day after the fire was detected, and for another 6 weeks, we averaged about 3 inches of rain. How much fell at this Bright Angel station? Less than 1/4 of an inch. We only had 2 days of rain through that entire period. Now, some parts of the fire saw a little bit more, 1/2 inch, maybe just over 3/4, but still far from the average of 3 inches. The lack of the monsoon was a critical factor in the growth of this fire. Okay, so the rapid growth from July 25 through August 1st, record dry air mass. We showed that. Persistent strong winds, local red flag conditions on many days, much above normal high temperatures. Instability led to massive pyrocumulus formations. We had long distance spotting, lack of rainfall promoted long period of favorable wildfires spread, and fuels reached critical record dry values. All the ingredients were there, folks, for rapid fire growth. This is a fire that at this point would be impossible to manage. You can't get in front of a fire like this. It has to be managed very strategically, very safely for the just lives that are all out there fighting the fire. Now let's talk about the role of the National Weather Service. What do we do to support firefighting operations or those out in the field? Of course, we issue forecasts. We issue specific fire weather forecasts for every zone in northern Arizona, at least twice a day. We issue spot forecasts. These are forecasts requested from us for specific locations, most often for fires. You know, they might be prescribed burns, they might be managed burns, they might be wildfires, which haven't grown too much yet. We also issue red flag warnings when those times that we see coming up that we might have high winds, low relative humidities for a long period of time where there's high fire danger. We also do a lot of what we call decision support services. That's on-site deployment with core partners. It means we spend at least 2 weeks a year on-site at the Prescott Fire Dispatch, supporting those folks in response to and to fill some communication gaps that were discovered during the Yarnell incident way back in 2011. We provide specific briefings and forecasts for high impact fire weather as requested, or sometimes just as needed. We are a part of the team and a part of the conversation for post-fire hazards and flood assessment. Okay, the flash flood warnings that are issued come from our office, so we need to know what are those thresholds we might use for flash flood warnings and what areas might be flooded. We aid in the development of these flood thresholds, and we provide incident meteorologists to serve on-site at the wildfire. What you might know or might not know is that in most large wildfires, there is a meteorologist who's dedicated and on the front lines with all the fire managers on that fire. They're in camp. They're often sleeping in tents. They work 16 hours a day. They provide briefings to all the fire personnel. Those are called incident meteorologists. We've had a number of incident meteorologists in the National Weather Service office here in Flagstaff. Right now, we currently have only one, and that's Robert Rickey. Now, the post-Bravo flood risk, you know, what's very true is often the post-wildfire floods are often more deadly and damaging than the fire itself, okay? And we have a lot of resources at risk right now in the Grand Canyon, especially those along Bright Angel Creek. The Bright Angel drainage was severely burned, especially high up in the drainage. And the flow down Bright Angel Creek and Phantom Creek that comes in just above Phantom Ranch is expected to be much, much, much above normal for any significant rainfall that we get. The response is going to be very high. There are assets at risk, everything from the water pipeline down there to Phantom Ranch itself that could be threatened in the case of a major flash flood. So we're working very closely with the Park Service, the USGS, and other agencies to set up warning strategies for the Bright Angel Creek area. But there's other river miles that are impacted by drainages that drain out of the Dragon Bravo scar. North Canyon and South Canyon river miles 17 and 21 could be powerfully impacted because a lot of the area that was burned up here drains down these two drainages. And we've already seen some flooding in these drainages. This was from a USGS survey of the North Canyon drainage, showing some of the ash very far, you know, we're talking miles downstream from the fire itself, working its way down to the Colorado River. And on the Grand Canyon Expedition's Facebook page, they showed the Colorado River turning black from ash, okay, that came out of North Canyon, likely from the 5th or 6th of September event, I should say 4th or 5th. So things are happening. We haven't had a truly massive rainfall event over this burn scar yet, but we will, okay? It's going to happen. We need to prepare for it. So on-site meteorologists. We talked a little bit about IMETs and what they do, but what I want you to do is just listen to Rob Rickey himself. The other day I chatted with Rob, asked him a couple questions. He spent 16, 17 days up on the Dragon Bravo from the 27th through August 11th during this massive growth period. Rob was the IMET on site supporting those managing the fire. Let me start a little video here.
Okay, Rob, so tell us, what does the National Weather Service IMET do when supporting a large wildfire?
So really, the main task of an IMET on a large wildfire is really to keep the firefighters and the public safe. And so we do that through two main ways. We make weather forecasts that are specifically targeted for the weather fire itself, so very dialed into the fire, to give folks basically a heads up if there's any unexpected weather on the horizon or any hazardous types of weather. And then the other big responsibility is really just briefing those weather forecasts to make sure that people understand what's coming in. So I'll spend about half my day working on a weather forecast, and the other half of the day is basically briefing. So briefing firefighters, the crews before they go out for the day, briefing the decision makers for planning so they can design tactics to contain the fire, days or even maybe a week in advance. And then also members of the public and various stakeholders. So there'll be people impacted by the fire. You could think of like a rancher. You could think of utility companies, and so I'll be giving them briefings to update them on the status of the fire as well for their planning, and so that they can make adjustments in order to kind of mitigate the impacts that the fire is having on them.
And I asked Rob one other question.
And Rob, to wrap it up, what would you say might be one of the most memorable aspects of this fire?
I would say the most memorable aspect was really like the fire activity. We weren't necessarily dealing with really super windy days, although we did deal with multiple days of gusty winds, which is somewhat unusual during the monsoon season. But we were so dry that the fire activity would pick up early in the morning, would put up huge plumes with very, very extreme fire behavior, and that fire would continue to burn through the evening and even most of the overnight hours, because we were just dealing with such dry conditions that really the humidities never really came up enough to subdue that fire activity. So it was really day after day after day of very extreme fire behavior.
And that's what it felt like, didn't it? As we looked at the news, as we followed this story, it just seemed never ending, that the fire continued. It was so hard to manage, burning in such extreme conditions. So, you could almost summarize it by saying the Dragon Bravo fire was initiated in the worst place, at the worst time, followed by the worst possible conditions, okay? A lot of fires start early in the monsoon. A lot of fires are put out very quickly by rains that follow. Not the Dragon Bravo. We know that the fuels were extremely dry. The weather was anything but favorable. The weather was really the major driving fire, or the major driving force, along with the very dry fuels. Now, of course, the Weather Service is going to continue to work hand in hand with all the fire weather partners and other agencies to continue to support any mitigation efforts, strategies for flood warnings. These conversations are continuing and will probably continue for the next couple years. So at this point, I'll take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. My question, I guess, is about, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So the day, the 11th and 12th, when it ran towards the developed area.
Yeah.
The white sage fire also had blown up during that time. Would that have affected the weather, the fire behavior of the Dragon Bravo?
Oh, great question. Now, the question was, did the large white sage fire that grew 40,000 acres between, let's say, July 10th and July 12th impact the Dragon Bravo fire, which was just, let's say 50 miles to the north? Short answer, no. But they're both a reflection of the conditions at that time, conditions that promoted extreme fire growth. But good question. There really isn't a weather coordination, or one didn't really impact the other.
So I'm curious, would the heat from the fire itself contribute to the dryness of the atmosphere? Because it seemed to surge after it burned for several weeks. Would that help dry out the atmosphere?
That's the question was, would the heat from the fire help to dry out the atmosphere? Only to a very, very minor and local extent. Imagine we are within an ocean of atmosphere, and the fire is just one kind of pinpoint, and that ocean is moving over us at all times. So it's continuously being replaced by the larger atmosphere. So while there might be a local effect, of the heating, of the extreme heat very near to the fire, the overall impact is managed by the surrounding atmosphere.
Time for one more question. We got one earlier.
Thank you. What kind of tools does the IMET have capable when they're on site as far as additional services or even additional satellites? And how do they connect in with command, control, and communications to the people on the ground actually fighting the fire?
Great question. The question was, what additional tools does an IMET have serving there at the fire location? They have the full suite of computer support, atmospheric models, and information that we have at the National Weather Service. They basically have that full suite of data. They also have other tools at their command. They have a small portable radiosonde system they might use to launch weather balloons and assess the atmosphere directly on site. But of course, being on site is the most important part. You get to watch fire behavior as the day progresses. You get to communicate directly. You are in, let's say, the dispatch center, of that fire. So any observations you have can be relayed immediately out to the field. Let's say you see a thunderstorm forming, it drops an outflow boundary, which is going to shift the winds. You can get that information to the field immediately from the IMET. So the IMET has the tools and the communication resources to make sure that people are notified of any rapidly changing conditions.
All right, thank you. I'm sure Brian can stay and answer any other questions. Let's do one more round of applause. Just a couple quick notes. One is if you have attended one or more talks today, please fill out our survey. Let us know feedback about the talks, about the whole open house. And if you could do that for any Festival of Science activities that you attend, we would be incredibly grateful. We also have the entire list of festival activities on these little tabloid guys on the table over there, if you would like to get those. A couple quick notes that Lowell Observatory Open House continues for another hour. At 7 p.m. in the giant screen Lowell Universe Theater, our educator Mason will be giving a Meet the Planets talk. So if you want to go see that in a absolutely mind-blowing scenery, that is where you should do that. We also have some telescopes up on the rooftop that you can take a look at. They're pointed at whatever they can. It has cleared up nicely, so yeah, the sky's nice. And feel free to wander and enjoy any of the exhibit halls.